Hey guys, welcome back, and today we're going to be looking at completing the square. So for our think slash warm up, I have multiply x plus 4 squared. Remember, when we have something like this that's all together squared, we don't just distribute that squared, but what squared really means is something times itself. And so remember, multiplying these, we do x times x, which is x squared, 4 times x, which is 4x, x times 4 again, which is another 4x, and then 4 times 4, the last thing we have there is 16. Well, if we'll notice then when we combine like terms, 4x plus 4x is plus 8x plus 16. And I asked ourselves to notice something about this, because this is a special case, right, where we square something. Well, we'll notice two things. When we go from here, basically when we go from here to here, what do I notice? Well, I noticed that when I have squared, we have something twice, right? We have 4 plus 4, which is 8, and then we multiply those things to get our last one. But what's nice about this last thing? Well, I think since this squared, we can kind of see that this 4 got squared at the end, because we're always going to get 4 times 4. So this last number always does eventually get squared, right? Because eventually you'll have that number times itself somewhere. So that's where that 16 comes from. But how does that 16 interact? Notice that if we were to go the other way, it might just be a nice coincidence, but maybe not, that if we take half of 8 and then square it, we'll get 16. And that makes sense. And that's exactly what happened, right? Because if we kind of had half of it, because when we have this squared pattern, it shows up twice. We're going to get plus 4 plus 4, which is really the thing in half, right? So if we have this, 8 divided by 2 is 4, and then square it, we get this last number, and we can turn it into this first thing that we started with. And we're going to kind of do that here, right? So if we were to actually factor this, we would need x and x to get x squared, and then you could do this. We need to multiply to 49 and add to negative 14, and you could find it out this way, and you say, oh, that's negative 7 and negative 7 that do that. And then we'd say, oh, that's x minus 7 squared. That's just a nicer way to write it, right? But hey, check this out. Don't we have that same pattern again? Half of 14 is 7. 7 squared is 49, right? And then we end up getting that 7 times 7 to get that 49. We've split this in half because we're going to end up adding these two, and then we're going to square it to get that last number. So we're going to use this pattern, that idea, for today's lesson. And so using that pattern, we can complete the square. Here are the steps for completing the square. I'm not going to read it out loud. I'm going to give you a chance to read this. Pause the video, read this, write it down, absolutely write it down. But I think it's just best seen through an example. So once you have it paused and written down, come down here, solve x squared plus 80 equals negative 18x for all values of x by completing the square. Well, our first step said to get everything with a variable on one side and constants on the other. So let's do that. So to get this 18x over here, maybe I'm going to add 18x to both sides. And then I'm going to be left with x squared plus 18x plus 80 equals 0, right? And this is what we used to want. But hey, this says get constants on the other side. So constants being things without x. So in that case, I'm actually going to get rid of this 80 by subtracting it on the other side. So I'm going to be left with x squared plus 18x equals negative 80. 0 minus 80 is negative 80. Now step 2 says divide the x term by 2 and square it. So when I say that, I mean this, the term with the x. Divide it by 2 and square it, just like we did before. So let's do that. 18 divided by 2, well, that's 9. And then it said square it. 9 squared is 81. Okay, we did that. Now it says add this number to both sides of your equation. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to say x squared plus 18x. And I'm going to do exactly what it said. I'm going to add this number to both sides of my equation. Plus 81 equals negative 80 plus 81, right? Because what I do to one side of the equation, I have to do the other. And now we could see that this is that pattern. The whole point of doing this is this now turns into 8 plus 9, or maybe I'll write it down here because this is our step 4 actually, right? Our step 4 is rewrite our variables as a binomial squared. This plus or minus really just depends on whether you had a plus or minus here. Since we have a plus here, we're good. And so that's going to turn into x plus 9 squared. And then negative 80 plus 81 is just 1. And now step 5 is just solve. We know how to solve that thing. We just take the square root of both sides. This is what we just learned how to do. When I take a square root, I need to add plus or minus. Don't forget that. And so I'm going to get x plus 9 equals plus or minus the square root of 1 is just 1. Subtract the 9 over. Get x equals negative 9 plus or minus 1. Our answer isn't finished here because we have 2. We have negative 9 plus 1 and negative 9 minus 1. Negative 9 plus 1 is negative 8, and that'll be negative 10. So we have 2 different answers. And one thing to note here, when we halved it, what you get after having it should always go in for this thing squared, right? Because then the whole point of squaring it, you just have to do that to your equation so that you can actually write this as x plus 9 squared. But what actually goes in this binomial should be what you get when you have it. But what you need to add to the equation is what you get when you square it. Now, for the rest of these, I'm going to go a lot faster, just because you have the time to pause and soak it in for each step. So we have x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Again, first step was just to get everything, all the variables on one side alone. So I'm going to have x squared minus 6x. I want to move that 5 over, equals negative 5. And now, step 2 is finding that number. We need to take that middle number and have it. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And then we need to square that number. 3 squared is 9. And then step 3 was add that number we just got to both sides. So plus 9. Oops. Equals negative 5 plus 9. And again, we end up getting this thing where now we can write that as x. And this time, that's a minus 6x. So we're going to need minus 3 squared equals negative 5 plus 9 is 4. And just a real quick detour to make sure you did this right. If I want to calculate out x minus 3 squared, I can do that to make sure I did it right. Right? X times x is x squared. We're going to have minus 3x minus another 3x plus 9. Negative 3 times negative 3 is plus 9. So together that's x squared minus 6x plus 9, which is exactly what I have here. So that works out. Right? And then here we're just solving by square roots, which we already did. To get rid of the square, take the square root. When I do that, I need to have plus or minus every single time. So then I'm left with x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 4 is 2. Then I add that 3 over to solve for x. I get x equals 3 plus or minus 2. But we can do that, right? We can do that. We can do 3 plus 2, and we can do 3 minus 2. 3 plus 2 is 5, and 3 minus 2 is 1. And here's our two answers we would put into Delta Math. Just keeping it going, solve x squared minus 14x equals negative 47 for all values of x by completing the square. Hey, step 1 is done for us, right? We have everything with an x on this side, so let's not even worry about it. Step 2, we have to have our thing in the middle. 14 divided by 2 is 7, and then we need to square it, and that gets 49. Step 3 is we need to add that to both sides. Step 4, now we can rewrite this trinomial as x. We have a minus 14x here, so we're going to need to put a minus there. And then negative 47 plus 49 is 2. And all the hard work is done. Now we just need to take the square root. Whenever I take the square root, I need to do plus or minus from our last lesson. And so then we get x minus 7, because the square root undoes the square, equals plus or minus the square root of 2. The square root of 2 isn't anything nice, right? It's not one of our perfect squares, so we're just going to leave it like that. And then we're going to add 7 to both sides. So then we're going to get x equals 7 plus or minus the square root of 2. And you can just put that right into Delta Math. Since we can't do anything nice, since it's the square root of 2, we can't put that with the 7. You can just leave it like this, and Delta Math has a nice plus or minus button for you to use, as well as a square root. Here, I took away the steps because we should just be comfortable by now. We need all the x's on one side and the constants on another, so I'm going to add 12x to both sides. Well, and then I know that I'm going to want this 21 over on the other side, so let me just subtract 21 on both sides while I'm at it. So those go away, those go away. What I really have left is x squared plus 12x equals negative 21. Okay, now we do that same thing. I'm going to take 12 divided by 2, which is 6, and then I'm going to square 6 to get 36, and then I'm going to add that to both sides. So x squared plus 12x plus 36. And again, the reason I can't just add whatever I want to an equation, I have to do the same thing to both sides of an equation, so that's why I add 36 there. Then I can rewrite that as x plus, this other number should always be what you got after you halved it, x plus 6 squared, right? Because then we're going to get a 6x plus 6x, which is 12x, but 6 times 6, which is 36. And then negative 21 plus 36 is going to be 15. Take the square root. Whenever I take the square root, I need to put plus or minus in front, and then square and square root cancel, and I'm left with x plus 6 equals negative plus or minus square root of 15. The square root of 15 is nothing nice, so we are just leaving that as it is, and then I simply subtract the 6 over to get x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 15. And again, since the square root of 15 isn't anything nice, we can't combine those, so we're just going to leave it just like that for Delta Math. one last example. Be careful, if you remembered maybe at the top of our list here, what I have in red here is make sure the coefficient on the x squared term is 1. And so in a case like this, we're going to need to do something first, right? If we're going to solve by completing the square, the thing on our x squared term might not, or is not 1. First, just because it technically comes first on the list, even though making sure your x squared term is 1 is the number one thing. The first thing I tell you is get every variable on one side and everything else on the other. So let's just go ahead and do that. So then we're going to have 2x squared minus 24x equals negative 54. Now, we need this coefficient on x squared to be 1, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide everything by 2 so that happens, right? 2 divided by 2 is 1, so really just x squared. Negative 24x divided by 2 is going to be negative 12x. And then negative 54 divided by 2 is going to be negative 27. And now we can do this, right? And the reasoning for that is we wouldn't be able to factor this into our perfect square if we had a 2 here, because then we would need, on our binomials, then we would need a 2x and something times an x in order to get 2x squared, right? Which we wouldn't have with one of those squareds. It needs to be x and x. So let's divide 12 by 2 and we get 6. And then we square that number. And then I say, hey, add 36 to both sides. Now this side you should be able to, it's a minus now, you need to take that into account, x minus 6 squared, that changes into that. These two things are the same thing, just written differently, right? Equals, and then 36 minus 27, well 36 minus 7 is 29, minus another 20 is just going to be 9. We could take the square root of both sides. When we do so, we need to add plus or minus. Then I'm going to be left with x minus 6 equals plus or minus the square root of 9 is 3. Add 6. X equals 6 plus or minus 3. Oh, but hey, we can do that, right? We're going to have x equals 6 plus 3 and x equals 6 minus 3. So x is going to be 9 and x is going to be 3. And here's our two answers that we put into Delta Math. And that is going to do it for 2.5.